7 daughters, 7 perfectly made beds, 7 pairs of nightgowns folded neatly at the foot of each mattress. October 13th, 1889, Selkirk, Montana, a town built on silver, scripture, and secrets. That morning, there were no signs of forced entry, no smashed window panes, no muddy boot prints on the parlor rug. But the Thornfield sisters, Margaret, Catherine, the twins Elelena and Elizabeth, Sarah, Grace, and Rebecca, had vanished from their home as if pulled into the ether, and their disappearance was not the result of chance. It was engineered. For decades, the story was suppressed, sealed under federal orders, locked away with menacing efficiency. The official reports were heavily redacted, but the details that weren't burned, that weren't scrubbed from the ledgers, suggest something far more disturbing than a simple missing persons case. They point to an ancient network, a machinery of flesh and control that preyed on innocence, an economy built not on silver, but on obedience, on secrecy, on disappearance. These sisters weren't chosen at random. No, they were bred, watched, and positioned. Raised not just as daughters, but as offerings. Selkirk wasn't a town. It was a stage, a front, a proving ground for a much older system that still operates today, in boardrooms, in courthouses, and in communities just like yours. And Gabriel Thornfield, the widowed patriarch who arrived in town with nothing but a wagon and a dream, he wasn't who he claimed to be. The whispers of his private midnight guests, the fortune he amassed in just 7 years, the political influence he wielded without office, all point to a truth too dark for the average man to stomach, that he wasn't their protector. He was their handler. What you're about to hear is not folklore, not myth. It's a suppressed history carved in the hidden architecture of the American West. This isn't just about what happened to 7 young women. It's about the world that made their disappearance necessary. Keep listening, because once you see how deep this tunnel goes, you'll understand. You were never meant to hear this story, but now that you have, there is no going back. Prepare for descent. What looks like charity is often the soft hand of control. What feels like family can be a cage built from lies. Selkirk in the autumn of 1889 was the perfect illusion. Golden leaves, polished storefronts, and hymns echoing from the church bell tower. But beneath its picturesque surface, something ancient stirred, something older than railroads or religion. It thrived in institutions. It cloaked itself in respectability, and it fed on children born into obedient bloodlines. The Thornfield sisters were never ordinary girls. Each one had been molded, not nurtured, but refined. Margaret, the eldest, was no mere teacher. She was trained to lead and submit. Catherine's art was celebrated, but her skill was observation, to see without being seen. The twins were praised for their needlework, but that was only surface. What they truly wove was silence. And Grace, with her uncanny mind for numbers, wasn't just managing ledgers. She was mapping the hidden economies of power. They were not being raised for life. They were being curated for placement. The youngest, Rebecca, barely 14, was the anomaly. Too radiant, too full of questions. The kind of light that draws attention from the wrong kinds of men. And in places like Selkirk, that kind of light is either extinguished or sold. Gabriel Thornfield's home was a fortress of appearances. 3 floors of imported wood, stained glass from Boston, a piano in the parlor, but the basement was sealed. No maid ever cleaned it, no child ever played there. At night, the household help recalled hearing low voices, not from drunkenness or prayer, but ritual, rhythmic, purposeful. It was during those nights that the sisters changed. Their laughter grew quieter, their routines more synchronized, like they were rehearsing something, like they were preparing. Selkirk's sheriff at the time, Silas Corwin, requested federal assistance after one of his deputies went missing, the same deputy who'd attempted to question Gabriel about the out-of-town visitors arriving by train under false names. Within a week, the case was removed from his hands. The deputy's remains were never recovered. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a removal. The Thornfield sisters weren't taken in the dark. They walked into the night willingly, together, silently, as if answering a call, older than law. And the town? It went back to sleep, because Selkirk had already learned. The cost of asking questions is blood. The Thornfield house still stands, empty, rotting. Locals won't go near it. The children call it haunted, but the old men know better. It's not haunted, it's consecrated. To what, they won't say. But the stories that survived, whispered in saloons, scribbled in church margins, suggest the house was never a home. It was a portal. Gabriel Thornfield's rise to wealth wasn't luck, brilliance, or grit. It was access, connections, bloodlines, the kind of ancient access that moves money without names and alters laws without signatures. Gabriel didn't find Selkirk. He was sent there to anchor something. You see, after the Civil War, there were places across the American West that weren't just being settled, they were being seeded. Towns like Selkirk became laboratories, test zones, not for weapons, for control systems. Think of it, 1 man, 7 daughters, no mother, no oversight, a railroad station 2 blocks away, a town council made of men who owed him their jobs. It was the perfect mechanism. And here's where it gets darker. In 1933, when the sealed files on the Thornfield case were quietly reviewed during a congressional audit of unsolved disappearances, a single note was discovered in the margin of a typed report. It read, "Asset success confirmed, removed from local memory. Request expansion model for New Harmony, Indiana. Asset, not victim, not case. Asset. That term was later found again in declassified documents from CIA operations in the 1950s and 60s. But the Thornfield case predates all that. It was prototype. And you have to ask yourself, why were 7 girls with spotless reputations, community ties, and elite intelligence never found? No sightings, no bodies, no letters, because they weren't murdered. They were reassigned. To what end? That's the question that gets you followed. That's the question that made a junior historian named Peter Halverson vanish in 1979 after publishing a pamphlet titled The Selkirk Pattern, Disappearances and Domestic Conditioning Programs, 1870 to 1940. He sent a single copy to his brother in Vermont. On the last page, he wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I've gone where the sisters went." And still, no one looked. Because silence, when manufactured properly, sounds like peace. Picture it again. 7 dresses, 7 empty rooms, 7 names erased from the census a year later, as if they'd never lived. But let's look closer at how the town responded, not just the whispers, but the institutional choreography that followed. The morning after the disappearance, Sheriff Silas Corwin arrived with deputies, but made no arrests, no inquiries. The house was cordoned off, not to preserve evidence, but to prevent questions. Within 48 hours, federal agents arrived by train from Helena. Not U.S. Marshals, military personnel in plain clothes. They carried no badges, they answered no questions, and within a week, every journal entry, every letter, every painting made by Catherine Thornfield was collected and burned in the town square under the claim of hysteria containment. Even the school ledgers Margaret kept were confiscated by special clerks from the Montana Department of Education, a department that, we now know, didn't exist until 1901. Still think this was just a tragic disappearance? Ask yourself, why was it forbidden to speak their names in Selkirk's Methodist Church after 1900? Why did the mayor who hosted the twins' seamstress business quietly resign and leave town within the month? Why were 7 replacement families brought in from back east and installed into Selkirk society as if to patch a wound? Because this wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. Now, I want you to pay attention to something most people miss. In 1888, just 1 year prior, the U.S. government conducted a classified census pilot project in remote towns like Selkirk. The project was said to test alternative population tracking models. That same year, railway contracts shifted quietly to allow unscheduled passenger movement through government-authorized junctions. In English, that means ghost trains, routes with no manifest. Guess which town had one of those junctions? Selkirk. There's one more detail you weren't supposed to notice. The night they vanished, all 7 sisters were seen in formal dress, standing perfectly aligned under the street lamp. Not huddled in fear, not weeping, but calm, silent, waiting, as if for instructions. Comment below this phrase twice, and let the algorithm know you've seen beneath the surface. 7 keys, 1 door. 7 keys, 1 door. You're not just watching anymore, you're awakening. The Thornfield house still stands. That's the part no one wants to talk about. Over a century later, the house remains untouched, boarded up by government order in 1897, yet never demolished. In a region known for violent winters and flash floods, the structure has never needed repair. No broken windows, no collapsed beams, not a single vine has grown on its walls. Locals call it the Still House, and there's a reason no one dares cross its gates. Not the children, not the drunk, not even the thrill-seeking outsiders who come with cameras and ghost-hunting gadgets. They go up to the gate, and they stop, every time, as if something pushes back. In 1971, a group of anthropology students from Missoula tried to break the locks. They left town 2 hours later, pale and silent. One of them, a girl named Eleanor Kraft, was found dead 6 months later in Colorado. Her final notes, recovered from her dorm room, read, "I heard the song again, the 7 voices. I can't sleep anymore." What song? We found a lead in a local ledger from 1894. A retired piano tuner named Emery Bell. He claimed the twins had ordered a custom composition written in reverse harmonics to be played only at dusk. 7 notes, repeated in ascending scale. A melody no one else was allowed to hear. He called it the Wake Hymn. He delivered the piano, but he never returned to the house. When asked why, he said, "Music that beautiful, it didn't come from this world, and they knew it." But here's the part that should haunt you. The blueprint of the Thornfield house, which we recovered through federal archives, shows 7 identical rooms built in a spiral configuration, not in a hallway, not in a circle, in a spiral, like a shell, like a ritual labyrinth. In each room, 1 bed, 1 mirror, 1 locked drawer, and behind each mirror, a cavity just large enough to fit a human body. You'll think they were just sisters? The deeper you dig, the more the earth bleeds truth. This wasn't a home. It was a chamber, a containment structure, a design. And maybe, just maybe, they were never meant to leave. Father Elias McCrae was no stranger to darkness. He had ministered to cholera wards, stood by mass graves, and even exorcised a boy in the coal camps of eastern Pennsylvania. But what he saw at the Thornfield house broke him in a way no devil ever had. In the fall of 1895, following the death of 2 neighboring children under mysterious circumstances, the town elders pleaded with the Catholic diocese to send help. Rumors swirled. Sightings of the sisters in fields where no footprints followed, wild animals found dead with their eyes turned inward, and dreams of music that bled from the soil. The diocese sent McCrae, a hard, ascetic man with more faith than warmth. When he arrived, he didn't speak, just stared at the house like he recognized it, like it had followed him from somewhere else. He brought relics, holy water, salt, and a team of altar boys from St. Joseph's. One account says he never made it past the gate. Another, recorded in the private journal of altar boy Jeremiah Finch, claims otherwise. He stepped onto the path, and the birds went silent. I saw his hand tremble when he touched the gate. He said he felt a pressure behind his eyes, and then he turned around and told us to run. Finch would later describe Father McCrae as a man who came back hollow. He wouldn't leave his room for 3 weeks, refused to eat, burned his vestments, and when questioned by the Bishop of Helena, he muttered only one sentence: "Those girls aren't girls. They were sent, and they don't pray back." 2 months later, McCrae was found dead in a locked room in the monastery, his body surrounded by 7 burned candles and a piano key placed neatly on his tongue. The cause of death was ruled as self-inflicted trauma, but no one explained how the door was locked from the outside. There is no official record of any blessing being performed at the Thornfield house. No rites, no cleansing, no holy claim. It was left untouched, a place even God refused to mark. The land behind the Thornfield house was never consecrated, never mapped, and never claimed. Locals called it the Back Acre, a dense, uneven patch of ground smothered in thick brush and thornroot. But the children of Millbrook had another name for it: the Silent Garden. No birds sang there, no insects buzzed, even the wind seemed to veer away from the soil. In 1902, a traveling gravedigger named Malcolm Doone spent a single night in Millbrook. He had heard stories of the sisters, and stories were what he chased. He wasn't a man of faith, but of obsession. Bones spoke louder than books to him. He made his way to the silent garden under moonlight, carrying a spade and a flask. By dawn, he was found on the road out of town, face pale, eyes wide, fingernails torn from clawing at the dirt. In his pocket, a single page torn from the Book of Job, and a molar fused with a child's locket. When asked what he saw, Doone whispered only, "They're stacked wrong. It's not a graveyard, it's a cellar." It took him 6 years to speak again, and when he did, he tried to burn down the library of the Archdiocese in New York. In 1921, after a flash flood unearthed parts of the Back Acre, townsfolk discovered skeletal remains, dozens of them buried in chaotic layers, skulls facing downward, hands bound with rusted wire, and in some cases 2 skulls in a single cavity. Some were adult-sized, others not quite. The coroner, Dr. Langston Bell, refused to sign the death certificates. His report was brief and brutal. Too many sets of teeth, and none of them matched the age of the bones. The sisters, when asked, simply smiled. They claimed the land was a garden, one for forgotten seeds. None of the graves had names, just crude symbols carved into flat stones, crosses turned sideways, circles with dots in the center, and an eye. Always the eye. Today, the Sile. And garden remains unmarked, fenced off with iron stakes. Children are told never to climb over. But every few years one does, and every few years the town gets quieter. In the fall of 1835, Sister Agnes brought a guest to the convent, a pale, silent young woman named Lizette. She wasn't dressed as a nun, she didn't speak, and no one knew where she came from, but she carried with her an old mahogany music case, and in it a cracked sheet of parchment covered in hand-drawn notes. The Sisters of Millbrook called her the mute pianist. They cleared out the chapel, rolled in a harpsichord from storage, and set her down before it. Her first note sounded like wind cracking through the bones of the church. Her second made the crucifix over the altar tilt slightly. By the third, Sister Mary Ann began to cry. No one knew what she played. The sheet music she followed seemed unreadable, full of symbols, spirals, and sigils that weren't Latin, weren't Greek, but pulsed with some kind of primitive rhythm. She would play every night, and every night the house grew colder. Then the dreams started. Sister Imelda claimed she saw a man with no face kneeling by her bedside. Sister Ruth woke up with bruises on her collarbone in the shape of piano keys. Even the Mother Superior confessed that the wine in the sacrament turned bitter each morning after Lizette played. Still, no one told her to stop. One night, during a thunderstorm, a sound echoed through the entire house. Not the piano, but voices, low, droning, chanting in time with Lizette's fingers. The sisters rushed to the chapel. Lizette was playing blindfolded. Behind her, the wall was bleeding. A thin trickle that ran from a crucifix down into the stone floor, seeping into the cracks. And her fingers? They were raw, skin split open. Still, she played. After that night, 3 sisters vanished. Their beds untouched, doors locked. But inside each of their rooms was a single object, a broken piano key wrapped in a strip of lace. Lizette was gone too. The harpsichord remained, now cracked, ked, and missing several strings. The chapel was closed forever, nailed shut, and the remaining sisters took a vow: never again would music be allowed on sacred ground. Yet sometimes, if you stand outside the chapel window on a rainy night, they say you can still hear her, playing that impossible tune. October 13th, 1835. A sister's scream echoed through the stone corridors of Millbrook Inn. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of discovery. Sister Constance had been sent to gather linens from the attic storeroom. What she found instead was a red trail bleeding through the ceiling boards. It dripped not from the roof, but from below, from the chapel. That room had been sealed since Lizette's final performance, nailed boards across the doors, heavy chain across the iron knobs, and yet the blood was rising, dripping upward, like the house itself was rejecting what had been buried inside. The Mother Superior ordered the attic and chapel both locked, but Sister Imelda disobeyed. She returned that night with a lantern and a crowbar. Her curiosity was fatal. The next morning they found the chapel doors wide open, inside nothing but the harpsichord. But Imelda was gone. All that remained was her rosary, tied around the music stand, and a long red line smeared across the keys like someone had played a hymn in blood. Then the real horror began. That night, the inn's second floor grew cold. Ice formed on the window panes from inside. The sisters who slept there woke screaming, choking on salt water. Their bedsheets were soaked, not with sweat or rain, but with brackish, foul-smelling water, thick and black like rot. One nun collapsed in the hall, her fingernails torn, mouth stuffed with cotton scraps from the old confessional booth. Another began to speak in a voice not her own, deep, male, and riddled with foreign tongues. The Mother Superior knew what had happened. The pact had been broken. When the harpsichord was sealed, they had made an agreement, though never in words, a kind of silence that kept something at bay. But Imelda's disobedience had awakened it, and now it was climbing, room by room, soul by soul. That's when they brought the oil. In secret, 3 of them. The eldest sisters gathered in the dead of night. They poured anointing oil on the chapel doors, on the floorboards, and even on their own tongues. Then they prayed, not to God, but to something older, something beneath. The next morning, every crucifix in the building had turned upside down. Imelda never returned, but the sisters stopped bleeding from their mouths. The black water receded, and for a time, the house grew silent again. She never left her cell, she never saw a man, but one winter morning she was pregnant. Her name was Sister Agnes, silent, withdrawn, and fiercely devout. For 12 years she never left her cell, except to kneel in the chapel, alone, long after midnight, long after the others had gone to bed. She'd taken a vow of perpetual silence and fasting. Her meals were slipped beneath her door, her prayers scrawled in charcoal on scraps of linen. The other sisters said she had visions, claimed to see things moving through the trees at night, whispering truths no one else could bear to hear. But in December of 1836, something changed. She stopped answering knocks. Her prayers stopped coming. But when they peered through the small square opening in her cell door, they gasped. Sister Agnes, thin as bone, eyes dark as wet ash, sat still in the candlelight, hands folded over her lap, and beneath the folds of her habit, a swollen belly, pregnant. The shock tore through Millbrook Inn like wildfire. No one had touched her. No one had even entered her room in over a decade, and yet, there it was, life, forming where it should never have. Mother Superior forbade anyone to speak of it, but secrets wrought in silence. One sister fainted when she saw the strange, fleshy symbols carved into the floorboards of Agnes's cell, circles within circles, bleeding at the edges like they'd been seared into the wood. Another swore she saw black vines growing up the cell walls, vines that weren't there in the morning. By January, Agnes began to weep blood. The child inside her moved, not with the rhythm of a human baby, but with sharp, erratic jolts, like something was trying to claw its way out. Sister Madeline reported hearing low growling noises through the stone. Sister Constance said she woke to see a face, a monstrous, pale face, pressed against the glass of her window, 3 floors up. Then, on February 3rd, it happened. Screams, inhuman, wet, piercing, echoed from Agnes's cell. When the sisters rushed in, the room was dark. The candle had gone out. Sister Agnes was dead, but the baby was gone. No blood, no body, no sign of birth, just a trail of ash, like someone had dragged something burning down the hall. That night, the screaming began again, but it wasn't Agnes. It was the sound of a baby, crying from the walls. He checked in as a newlywed. He came back 6 months later looking for his wife, but where her room had been was just a brick wall. In June of 1836, a traveling merchant named Thomas Bell arrived at Millbrook Inn with his young bride, Evelyn. Newlyweds, blissfully in love. She wore a white bonnet. He carried her trunk. They took room 3A, upstairs overlooking the orchard. Thomas stayed only 3 nights. Business called him east toward Lexington. Evelyn stayed behind, intending to wait for his return. She wrote him letters daily, but by mid-July, the letters stopped. He assumed illness. The roads were hard. Maybe she'd gone to stay with relatives. But when August passed with no word, and September came with a bitter chill, something inside him snapped. He returned to Millbrook just before the first snowfall. The inn looked the same, but colder, still. The fire wasn't lit in the hearth. No candle flickered behind the stained glass, and when he knocked, no one answered. Eventually, an old woman opened the door. Not Sister Margaret, not Sister Ruth. This one was thin, with pale cataract eyes and a trembling voice. "We have no guests," she whispered. Thomas pushed past her. The halls were dim, quieter than he remembered. He climbed the steps to room 3A, heart pounding, but when he reached the landing, he froze. The room was gone. Where the door had been was now a smooth brick wall, seamless, as though the room had never existed. He screamed for Evelyn, kicked the wall until blood poured from his foot. The old woman called for help, and 2 nuns came to remove him, but he refused to leave. He pulled out a yellowed letter Evelyn had written, proof she'd stayed there, but the sisters said they'd never heard of her, that no guest by that name had ever checked in, that room 3A had never existed. Desperate, he broke free and ran to the garden. He remembered Evelyn, loved the orchard. She'd picked apples from the crooked tree by the stone fence. He reached it and fell to his knees. There, nailed to the bark, was a strip of white cloth, torn from a bonnet, Evelyn's bonnet. But it was old, brittle, like it had been there for years. He looked up and saw them, dozens of pale faces, women staring down at him from the windows above, blank, expressionless, identical, all of them, Evelyn. When the floorboards of the old nursery were pulled up in 1932, the workers thought they'd found a forgotten well. What they'd really uncovered was a pit of hair, teeth, and tiny bones. After the closure of Millbrook Inn in 1904, the building stood empty for decades until a group of investors in the 1930s attempted to renovate it into a countryside lodge. They expected rot, rats, and ruined walls. What they found was far worse. On the second floor, behind a warped pink door with fading rose stencils, lay the nursery. Dust lay thick on every surface. The window was nailed shut, the rocking horse tilted on its side, and a single rattle rested in a cobwebbed cradle. It smelled of lavender and something else. One morning in 1932, two carpenters began removing the warped floorboards. The first few planks came up easily, but halfway through the crowbar slipped and cracked open something hollow beneath. They cleared away the wood and stared into a shallow stone pit no more than 3 feet deep. Inside were clumps of tangled hair, too fine to belong to an adult, baby teeth, and rows, dozens, of tiny bones jumbled together as if they'd been tossed in haste, fingers, ribs, even the curved remnants of infant spines. One of the men fainted. The other ran to fetch the foreman, who called the local authorities. But by the time the sheriff arrived, the pit was gone. The floorboards were somehow back in place, sealed, unbroken, no sign of tampering. The workers swore they'd pulled them up. The foreman backed them, but the sheriff laughed it off, muttering about bad whiskey and ghost stories. Still, the crew refused to enter the nursery again. That night, the youngest carpenter, Eli Morgan, returned alone. Determined to prove he wasn't crazy. He brought a lantern, a hammer, and a camera, but he never made it out. When they found him the next morning, he was curled in the crib, eyes wide, mouth filled with lint from an old stuffed bear. His camera was crushed, and every window in the room was nailed shut from the inside. They sealed the nursery that day, permanently. But stories persist. Of the sound of infants crying beneath the floor, of lullabies sung by voices no one recognizes, of the white rattles that sometimes appear on the front steps. They were buried together, two sisters wrapped in white cloth, hands folded, but the gravedigger swore he heard knocking, not from the wind, but from beneath the soil. By the fall of 1831, the whispers about Millbrook Inn had turned into accusations. Guests vanished. Children took ill. Locals refused to even ride past the property after sundown. But the final straw came when a traveling doctor, Dr. Caleb Rourke, went missing after treating one of the Cunningham sisters. The town demanded answers. Under pressure, the sisters invited a local magistrate to inspect the grounds. On the surface, everything appeared pious and well-ordered. Clean sheets, prayer books, fresh bread in the kitchen. But in the east wing, behind a wall that was strangely warm to the touch, the magistrate found a sealed door, painted over, bricked shut. It led to what had once been the isolation room, used for sick children. Inside, they found two girls, no older than 6, emaciated, delirious, lying on straw soaked in blood and milk. The Cunningham sisters claimed they'd been quarantined with consumption, but the magistrate wasn't convinced. 2 days later, the girls were dead. The town demanded the inn be closed and the sisters be tried. But before the authorities returned, tragedy struck again. The youngest two Cunninghams, Sister Annalise and Sister Ruth, were found dead in their quarters, poisoned, it seemed, laid out in their ceremonial gowns, faces serene. The other sisters claimed it was suicide. Grief, they said, guilt, a punishment from God. But the gravedigger, Samuel Ketch, told a different story. He'd been paid in silver to bury them before sunrise, said they were cold when he touched them, said their lips were blue, but when he lowered the coffin into the earth, he swore he heard movement, a scraping, then a knock. Once, twice, 3 times. He paused, heart thundering, but the others laughed, said it was just the shifting of wood. Still, when he covered the casket with soil, the knocking continued, slower, weaker, until it stopped. Ketch never returned to Millbrook. Some nights, long after, visitors would say the ground where the Cunninghams were buried was always warm, as if something beneath was still breathing, still waiting. And sometimes, on a windless night, you could hear that knocking again, 3 slow taps, from deep below. A crucifix above the altar, hollow, and inside it, letters, dozens of them, all written by trembling hands, all ending the same way. Please, Sister Agnes, don't let her take me next. After the deaths of Sisters Annalise and Ruth, the Millbrook Inn was abandoned. Dust settled where prayers once echoed, candles melted to nubs. But a decade later, in 1842, the property was purchased by a religious preservationist named Reverend Elijah Thorne. Thorne claimed his mission was pure, to restore the grounds as a place of sanctity and reflection. But within a month of his arrival, he made a chilling discovery. While cleaning the small chapel nestled behind the east wing, Thorne noticed that the crucifix above the altar seemed off. Lighter than it should have been, loosely nailed. When he removed it, a panel at the back slid open. Inside were folded notes, neatly stacked, yellowing with time. Each was written in a different hand, some in broken English, others in a child's script, some penned in frantic, ink-blotted strokes, and all addressed to Sister Agnes. But Sister Agnes had never been mentioned in the town records. No gravestone bore her name. The letters told stories too disturbing to be fiction. One described being led into the cellar and left alone with only the sound of dripping water and something breathing in the corner. Another told of girls forced to kneel for hours while Sister Agnes whispered things that made their ears bleed. Words not in any known language. One simply read, "Sister Agnes walks at night. She hums the song only the dead know. She touched my forehead, and I woke up 3 days later, not myself. I don't think I'm me anymore." Every letter ended the same. "Please, Sister Agnes, don't let her take me next." Thorne turned the letters over to the Historical Society, but they vanished en route. He closed the chapel that winter and fled at the property in silence. The crucifix was left behind, untouched since. Locals say if you enter that chapel today and speak the name Agnes aloud 3 times, the room chills instantly, and sometimes the cross creaks, as if shifting, as if something inside it is still listening, still waiting, still choosing. In the east wing window, a pale face watched every visitor, hollow eyes, a faint smile. The only problem? That wing was sealed shut in 1831, and the nun in the window had been buried, except she hadn't. For decades after the inn was shuttered, townsfolk avoided the eastern road. Not out of superstition, out of certainty. Every child in Millbrook grew up with the warning, "If you see her, don't wave, don't look too long, and never, ever follow her eyes. The legend began with a local boy named Cyrus Wilk. In 1853, curious and daring, he snuck onto the property with his older cousin, aiming to capture proof of the haunting. They circled the inn's rotting frame, daring each other to approach the sealed east wing. That's when Cyrus pointed upward. Second window from the end, there she stood. A nun, pale skin against black habit, thin, unmoving. Her head was slightly tilted, hands clasped at her waist, as if in prayer, but her eyes, Cyrus would later say, didn't reflect the sky. They swallowed it. Frozen with fear, they fled. But Cyrus couldn't stop thinking about her. The next evening, he returned alone. He was found 3 days later in the fields beyond the inn, alive but mute. He never spoke another word, not even on his deathbed, just stared, as if her eyes were still with him. Town records confirmed something worse. The east wing had been sealed in 1831 after a fire damaged its supports. No one had entered since, and then came the exhumation in 1862. As part of a church effort to relocate graves, a team arrived to disinter the bodies buried behind the inn. All were accounted for, except one. Sister Magdalene. She died in 1830. Her death was documented, her burial attended by 3 other nuns, but when her coffin was opened, it was filled with rocks. Rocks, wrapped in the linens of the order. A nun had been buried in name only. The town went silent after that. Today, the east wing's window is boarded up, but people say the boards shift every few years, rot from the inside, and if you stand just right in the moonlight, her face is still there, watching, waiting, not praying, pretending. They called it the Sister's Garden. Lavender, white roses, belladonna. But beneath that sacred soil, something far older was growing, fed not by rain, but by ritual. When the Millbrook Inn was still a functioning convent, the garden behind the east wing was its most pristine feature. Tourists and townsfolk admired its perfect symmetry, petals always blooming, colors never fading, but few asked why no one was ever seen tending it. Not a single spade, no watering pail, not even footprints in the soil, but every flower bloomed as if by command. In 1849, a local herbalist named Marta Finley took interest in the garden's unnatural health. She had studied botany across Europe, and nothing about those blossoms made sense. She requested permission to study the soil. The sisters refused, politely, firmly, repeatedly, until one night Marta returned alone with a lantern and a trowel. She was never seen again, but her lantern was found, still lit, next to the garden gate. The earth had been disturbed, the soil turned, and beneath the first layer of topsoil, officials discovered something else. Bones. Small, brittle, stacked vertically like offerings. Some belonged to animals, but not all. Among them, they found a child's femur, marked with notches, symbols, crosses burned into the bone itself. The entire garden was cordoned off, but by then it was too late. The town whispered. That wasn't a place of growth, it was a place of sacrifice. One former nun, Sister Therese, spoke anonymously to a priest before her death. Her confession was sealed but leaked decades later. She spoke of the root below, a term whispered in Latin prayers never meant for sunlight. She said the garden's shape matched an ancient sigil, a glyph of binding. What were they binding? She didn't say, only that when the lilies bloomed white in winter, the oldest one would speak. In 1863, during Ta'ad, he coldest February on record, the lilies did bloom, white as bone. That same night, 2 travelers vanished after sleeping beside the east hedge. Their campsite remained untouched, but their tent was found pulled underground, soil compacted over it. No bodies, no blood, just the scent of roses, and a single belladonna sprouting from the ash ring. She came to the Millbrook Inn in 1871, mud-covered, barefoot, eyes hollow like something had been carved out from behind them, and she said just 6 words, "I know what the garden hides." Her name was Clara May Hutchins. She couldn't have been older than 8. She arrived just before dusk, clutching a satchel made from stitched-together flour sacks. No adults with her, no explanation, only a name, a whisper, and the kind of silence that makes even crows go still. The sisters took her in without question. But this girl wasn't like the others. She didn't cry, didn't cling, didn't ask for food. She spent her first night standing in the hallway, staring down the corridor that led to the garden. Sister Margaret swore the child never blinked. The next morning, Clara asked for 3 things. 1. A length of twine. 2. A mirror. 3. And to speak with the sister who listens through the floor. That last request chilled the entire convent. They had never spoken of her aloud, the one they called Sister Elma, who'd lived beneath the chapel in self-imposed silence for 40 years. She hadn't spoken a word since 1832, when she'd scratched out her own tongue with a rusted pin. But when Clara entered that basement room, the nun stood, and then, according to multiple accounts, she spoke. "You brought it with you, the memory." What happened in that dark chamber remains a mystery, but the very next day, Sister Elma was found dead in her cot, smiling. And Clara? She walked into the garden, alone, without permission. She stayed in the center circle for 7 minutes, then emerged with her palms bleeding, whispering, "I saw them all. I heard their names." That night, she drew maps, symbols, sigils, names of women long dead, names never taught to her. Some scratched into the walls, others smeared onto pages with her own blood. Then she vanished. One sister claimed Clara simply ulked into the pantry and never came out again. Another swore the girl crawled back into the earth beneath the rosebed, like a seed returning to its root. No body was ever recovered, but the mirror she'd asked for, it still hangs in the convent hallway. And every winter, on the night the lilies bloom, it fogs from the inside, as if someone is breathing against it. From the other side, on February 3rd, 1873, during the last snowfall of that cursed winter, the Millbrook Inn bells rang 13 times at midnight, but no one was in the bell tower, no one alive anyway. The sisters had gathered for what was to be their final mass. Only 5 remained, the others dead, missing, or worse. The once bustling inn had become a tomb, windows boarded, rooms locked, hallways silent, except for the scraping sounds that came from inside the walls at night. Sister Agnes, the eldest, delivered the sermon, but she wasn't reading from the Bible. She held a red leather-bound book, stitched in a language no one recognized. The same book that had once belonged to Sister Elma. She spoke softly, rhythmically, eyes closed, almost in trance. One sister fled the chapel screaming after just the first few lines. She would later be found outside, curled in a fetal position near the garden, whispering, "The ground has mouths, it eats the holy." Inside, the others remained. When the bells began to ring, 1, 2, 3, Sister Agnes stopped chanting, her head tilted back, and she smiled. All 5 sisters walked from the chapel, single file, out into the falling snow, their hands clasped, their eyes vacant, And then, without hesitation, they each stepped into the frozen pond behind the inn, one by one, like it was baptism. No one emerged. By dawn, the inn stood completely still, every door locked from the inside, every candle extinguished. A mailman, arriving days later, found the property deserted. He broke in through the pantry, found the table set for 6, the teacups warm, but no one present. The garden had been torn apart, graves disturbed, roots clawed up, and that mirror in the hallway, cracked down the center. Over the next decade, at least 17 families attempted to restore or reopen the inn. None lasted more than a season. One man, Silas Moore, died after just 4 nights inside. His final diary entry read, "There are still voices in the bell tower, still steps in the snow, still prayers being whispered from empty rooms." The Millbrook Inn still stands today, forgotten, choked by vines, padlocked by the state. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, travelers hear distant bells, always 13 chimes, always at midnight, and somewhere beneath the lilies, the ground still breathes,